Ladies and gentlemen, we're fresh off of the Carlotta trailer, the Carlotta showcase. We've seen a little bit about her character. We've already seen some of her gameplay from IGN and how her kit is going to work. And now it's time for us to get into the last missing piece of the puzzle when it comes to our newest 5-star gun Resonator in Wuthering Waves, releasing in 2.0. And that is, ladies and gentlemen, her weapon. This is potentially one of the most exciting weapons we've seen released yet. First and foremost, because it looks absolutely brilliant. I mean, this is like the bling on this is absolutely incredible. Imagine what it's going to look like on her, and then imagine what it's going to look like on the rest of the the rest of the pistol cast in the game. And so with that, this weapon is going to be titled The Last Dance. You know, it has like a bunch of crystals, obviously, some cortado, some Italian in here to kind of spice it up a little bit. And the tagline is, when the Crimson Finale arrives, remember, death comes for all. So as you all can see, Carlotta is a little edgy. And when you combine that with the name, The Last Dance, when you combine the look of the character with, I guess, everything that we're seeing here, she's a little scary. She kind of fits that mafia boss vibe, and this pistol, her weapon, her signature weapon, is only adding towards it. And so obviously, we know what the weapon looks like. Now it's time for us to talk a little bit about its effect, its base stats, and how it's going to work on the rest of the cast. So first up, going over its base stats, at level 90, you know, in a synchronization rank 1 copy, this is the stats that we're looking at. A base attack of 500, which is actually on the lower end for 5 stars, but a whopping critical damage of 72%. And so if you guys are familiar with some of the rectifiers that have been released in the past, let me just go ahead and pull up Jedge's weapon. So this is Jedge's weapon in comparison. And so there have been a lot of individuals that have been thinking, oh, only rectifiers. Only rectifier characters are going to be the ones with lower base attack weapons and higher critical stats. You can see a base attack of 500 on Yinlin's weapon as well, and 36% crit rate, and obviously what we're seeing on Jedge's over here is that same lowered base attack and a massive crit damage of 72%. And so clearly, everybody that was saying that this kind of stat line, this kind of stat portfolio was reserved for rectifiers is actually wrong. This means that we're going to have other weapons in other classes, pretty much in all of the types available. They're going to be open to this potential stat line as well. And so the trade-off here, right, is that you're going to have much higher critical damage stats or critical stats overall, that second base stat, but you're also going to have a really significantly lower base attack in comparison. When other 5-star weapons have a base attack of around 587, including Static Mist, which is going to be Carlotta's second best option, when every single attack buff in the game, things like Verina's skill, Verina's inherent skill, things like Rejuvenating Glow and Moonlit Clouds, all of those buffs are going to be working off of this base attack provided by the weapon. This means that Carlotta, inherently, if you're using her signature, right, you're not going to get as much benefit. And let me just pull up a Verina real fast on my screen so you guys can see exactly what I'm talking about. So here's the comparison here, right? So when you're looking at things like Rejuvenating Glow, for example, right, increases the attack of all members by 15%. Looking at things like her inherent ability, right, increases the attack of the entire party by 20%. That means that the lowered base attack that we're seeing on Carlotta's weapon over here, it's not going to get as much of an impact from those effects. But on the flip side, it's going to have a critical damage stat that's literally about 28% higher than other critical damage weapons. And so it's a great thing that I pulled Jian's weapon so I could give you all a comparison of how different those stats actually are. And so we're seeing from Jian's weapon over here, right? He only has 48.6% critical damage, but an 87 additional base attack. So you're trading 87 base attack for, you know, roughly about 24% additional critical damage, which is the same as about 2 substat rolls at minimum value. So with that, keep that in mind as you're moving forward, as you're building up these characters, and you're thinking about how you're slotting it in with other members of your team or other members of your roster, because again, all weapons are shareable in endgame content like the Tower of Adversity, and so even if you're using Carlotta with her signature on one side, you could easily use another pistol resonator, right, with the same weapon equipped on other sides as well. And so with this stat profile in mind, it's pretty obvious that one thing is going to be happening with your forecast echo. You want a crit rate one. If you somehow have the stats to run a crit damage echo in the 4 slot, and you have a crit rate that's usable despite having that sort of imbalance, then you could potentially have the highest critical damage in the game with this character. And so we're not exactly sure what her inherent crit stats are. If she does have crit damage inherent stat boost as well, that will only add to her potential, but it's going to make it a little bit hard for her to build even at a baseline. So with that, we've covered all of her base stats. We've covered what this weapon is going to do overall. Now it's time for us to get into the weapon skill. And so this weapon skill is going to be called Silent Eulogy. And the baseline effect that it's going to have is increasing attack by 12% at S1. And then whenever you use an intro skill or your Resonance Liberation, your Resonance skill damage is going to increase by 48% for 5 seconds. And so right off of the bat, you have to keep in mind who can actually use this weapon. People who scale off of Resonance skill damage. And what this also means is that Carlotta clearly scales with Resonance skills, and that's what her base that's what a majority of her damage is going to be. So this is just even more clues about how much synergy she's going to have with a character like Jeja, who's going to boost Glacial damage and Resonance skill damage at the same time. When we think about other users of this weapon, the most likely applicable users on the roster will be, and let me just pull up my game again. The first user is going to be Chisha. And Chisha should be the first one that comes to mind for one reason alone, and that's the fact that her Resonance skill is, in fact, one of the main damaging parts of her kit. She uses this very frequently, she holds down the button, and basically, she does a lot of Resonance skill damage with this ability. She kind of enters like the whole Daka state. She has like all of these, she has like the increased damage over here by 50%, and she also has basically the attack buff that stacks up whenever she uses her Resonance skill and holds it down. And so basically, this is one of the best weapons possible for Chisha if you're slotting her in as a main DPS who's basically using this ability as often as possible. However, you have to keep in mind that the rather short duration of 5 seconds means that it might be a little bit tough on the timing to ensure that, you can actually get off all of those shots, do all of the damage without the buff expiring. Because you want to make sure, right, that this 48% buff is active when you fire off that big shot with Chisha. And so with that in mind, Chisha is probably going to be one of the best users for this, and she also likes casting a Resonance Liberation as well. All it does is it literally deals damage. And you're going to be able to follow up with another Resonance skill to deal even more damage after that and refresh the buff. One of the things you have to keep in mind is that Chisha, when she casts her Resonance Liberation, she immediately charges her entire Forte circuit at S4 and also resets the cooldown of her Resonance skill. So when you look at the level of synergy here, especially with at least an S4 Chisha, it works perfectly with how this weapon works, right? Because when Resonance Liberation is cast, you get the Resonance skill damage bonus, and then boom, when you have Chisha's S4, she resets all of these cooldowns. And then she also resets her Forte circuit and is able to continue delivering those big shots. And so, ladies and gentlemen, if you're a Chisha main, you have to pull this weapon. Or you don't have to, but if you don't pull this weapon, you're going to be very sad if you're a Chisha main. It's literally perfect for her, and it synergizes perhaps even better with her kit than it synergizes with Carlotta's at this point. So with that, the next user that we're going to be looking at is, surprisingly enough, ladies and gentlemen, it's going to be Alto. And you might be thinking, oh, who even uses this bastard anyways? But the fact of the matter is that Alto actually has a shit ton of synergy with Resonance skill and Resonance skill damage. And that's because, well, from his very first constellation, or his very first sequence node, he gets a shortened cooldown on the ability. And as it turns out, using this ability actually deals a significant amount of damage in his rotations. You want to open up your rotation with a Resonance skill, and the cooldown is low enough so that when you cast your Resonance Liberation, you gain your damage increase, you'll be able to cast it again. And ladies and gentlemen, there's one other thing about Alto that makes him synergize very well with this weapon. And that's the fact that his Forte circuit, right, that fires off these missed bullets, that deals Resonance skill damage. And so Alto's going to have the buff from this weapon applying to both his regular Resonance skill, which fires off 6 missed bullets, as well as his Forte circuit, which is going to fire off 6 missed bullets as well. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, those are going to be the top 2 users. Obviously, a lot of Alto's damage profile, while there is a lot of it coming from normal attacks, a lot of it also comes from Resonance skill damage as well. And so those are going to be the 2 top characters from my point of view on who's going to synergize well with this weapon. Let's talk about some people that aren't really going to work that well with it. And that first user is obviously going to be Mortefi. A majority of Mortefi's damage, ladies and gentlemen, is not really Resonance skill. His Resonance skill is mainly used to charge the Fury Fudge and basically just build Forte circuit stacks for him. As you can see, at a level 7 ability, this thing does no damage. A 14-second cooldown, it generates a lot of concerto, but it literally does less damage than some level like 3 abilities on other characters. it's really bad. Then we have the Fury Fudge damage, right? This is at level 7 as well, and it only does 216.16%. And you can surely use this a lot if you're like spamming his basic attacks very often, but guys, it's not that good, okay? Don't, unless you're like mainly looking for like the stat profile, you're really looking for like the critical damage piece and you're trying to synergize Mortiphy with that, this weapon is not really going to be that good, ladies and gentlemen. I'm just going to be honest. There's not a lot of value in it on Mortiphy, and since Mortiphy is more of a sub DPS, especially relative to characters like Chisha and Alto, you just want to put him on Static Mist so he can buff the Jian or buff the Danjin that's coming in after him. So, thankfully, there's not a lot of pistol users in the game, so this section doesn't have to be that long. But hopefully that has given you a great overview of who some of the best users are going to be and whether or not it's worth it for your account. Again, top priority picks are going to be Alto and Chisha, with Chisha having the most overall synergy on the roster. If you're an S6 Chisha main, or you at least have her S4, you're going to get a lot of mileage out of this weapon. But that's assuming that you have her built. Clearly, I don't. Next up. So when it comes to Carlotta's weapon compared to other options like Static Mist, you're going to have to keep in mind that Static Mist is going to be a bit more of a supportive weapon, right? Based off of the fact that it buffs the incoming Resonator's attack by 10%. Not really that great for somebody who's going to take on the main DPS role like Carlotta in the team. You know, the next person that takes her outro skill and this buff, they're not really going to be able to use it very well. However, the weapon is going to be a bit easier to build around, based off the fact that it provides 24.3% crit rate, which is a lot. And to do any damage with critical damage in the first place, right, you have to be able to crit. And so for some people who have really, really bad echo luck, or, you know, aren't really farming for her as much, Static Mist might be the better option in the present, just so that you can actually crit in the first place. And then once you get better and better echoes, and are actually able to better balance her ratios, maybe that's when you decide to swap to hers. Otherwise, right, if you have like 30% critical rate and then 270% critical damage, that's not going to be that helpful because you're not really going to crit in the first place. So that's going to be the comparison here. This might be a good stopgap while you're getting her built and getting her ready to go, but at the end of the day, right, the optimal damage is going to be with Carlotta's signature, but this isn't going to be a bad option either. But you have to keep in mind, she's not really going to be using this effect at all in most of her teams. It's time for us to get into her Ascension materials, and I have some very, very good news to share based off of what we're seeing here. Ladies and gentlemen, Kuro Games is not introducing new upgrade materials or new talent materials in the new region. And so what this means is that all of the farming you've done for all of your Phlogistons, right? You can farm for Carlotta and you can farm for her weapon right now. There are no region exclusive mats. And this is actually insane, because if you're familiar with other gacha games like HSR or Genshin Impact, you'll find that all of those games have region-specific upgrade materials, even if it's like the same weapon type. And what that means is you have to regrind, you're not able to advance your roster as fast as before, you can't do things like pre-farm, and Kuro Games just decided, hey, that's super player unfriendly. We're not going to do that, right? We want our players to have the best experience possible. We want them to be able to pre-farm for these. And so all of the upgrade materials for this weapon will, in fact, ladies and gentlemen, just be what's currently existing in the game. And so you got things like the tailored rings, which come from Exiles, and obviously that's not hard to get anymore after the Elusive Realm update. And it's just the same exact Phlogistons that you can farm right now. So getting this weapon to level 90 right after you pull it should not be a struggle at all, ladies and gentlemen. There should be no problems with this at all. And that's basically going to be it for this weapon. Overall, it's looking absolutely baller. It looks amazing. Probably one of the best, most visually appealing things in the game. It's got a powerful weapon effect that's usable on 2 out of 3 of the characters on the pistol roster. And it's easy to upgrade. So all I've got to say in regards to this is hats off to Kuro Games for making this weapon super accessible, making it actually useful for a large portion of the roster. And to me, it's one of the higher priority picks you can have in this game, primarily based off the fact that, well, it works on a majority of the pistol characters, and it's a big upgrade over Static Mist for characters that weren't doing the sub DPS role like Mortiphy and Alto. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, hopefully this was helpful and gave you some insight as to whether or not this weapon is worth pulling. Peace out.